There are words that no living person can read. Not because the documents that contain them are damaged or incomplete or written in a language that was once known and then forgotten, but because the civilization that produced them disappeared before anyone thought to write down what the symbols meant, before any neighboring culture recorded a translation, before any bilingual inscription survived to give a scholar a foothold, before the chain of transmission that carries meaning across time had a chance to form. The words exist. The inscriptions are there, carved into stone and stamped into clay and scratched onto pottery, preserved by the same accidents of burial and climate and archaeological fortune that have preserved so much else from the ancient world. They simply cannot be read. The meaning died with the people who understood it, and no key has ever been found. Subscribe now and never miss a documentary. Every week we travel somewhere that the conventional record has not fully mapped, into the silences as much as the ruins, into the questions that the evidence refuses to answer. The Indus script is the most studied undeciphered writing system in the world. For more than a century, since the first systematic excavations of the Indus Valley civilization began in the 1920s, scholars have been attempting to decode the symbols that appear on thousands of small soapstone seals, on pottery, on copper tablets, and on other objects recovered from the ruins of Mohenjo-Daro, Harappa, and the hundreds of other sites that once formed one of the largest and most sophisticated urban civilizations of the ancient world. The script consists of somewhere between 400 and 600 distinct signs. The exact count depends on how the signs are grouped and whether certain variants are counted as the same sign or different ones. The inscriptions are short, typically containing only 4 or 5 signs, and they appear on objects whose function is not always clear. And despite the efforts of some of the most brilliant cryptographers, linguists, and computational scholars of the past 100 years, no one has read a single word of the Indus script with any certainty that has been accepted by the scholarly community as a whole. That silence is not for want of trying. The Indus script has attracted more decipherment attempts than perhaps any other undeciphered system in history. Scholars have proposed that it encodes Dravidian languages, Indo-European languages, Sumerian, Proto-Munda, and a dozen other linguistic families. They have applied the methods of structural linguistics, statistical analysis, computer pattern recognition, and comparative mythology. They have published papers, written books, and engaged in debates that have sometimes become bitter and personal. And after all of that effort, the script remains silent. The civilization that produced it, a civilization that at its height may have encompassed a population of 5 million people, that built cities with sophisticated drainage systems and standardized weights and measures and long-distance trade networks, left behind a written record that the modern world cannot read. Tonight we go looking for these lost voices. We examine the undeciphered scripts, the broken codes, the written systems that have defeated every attempt at interpretation. We ask what it means to lose a language not just in the ordinary sense of forgetting, but completely, irrevocably, with no path back. The scale of the Indus civilization is worth pausing on, because it is easy to underestimate. There is a tendency, when thinking about ancient civilizations, to picture them as smaller and simpler than they actually were, to imagine the people of the deep past as primitive in ways that the evidence contradicts. The Indus civilization contradicts that tendency with particular force. Consider the standardized bricks. Across a civilization that stretched for more than 1 million square kilometers, an area larger than modern Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, baked bricks were made to the same proportional dimensions, roughly 4 to 2 to 1, length to width to height. Not the same absolute size everywhere, but the same ratio, consistently maintained from the smallest village to the largest city. That standardization implies coordination of a kind that is difficult to achieve even in modern industrial societies. A shared understanding of what the correct dimensions were, maintained across hundreds of settlements, across generations of builders, across a civilization that had no obvious central authority imposing the standard by force. Some shared cultural understanding, some institution we have not yet identified, some mechanism of coordination that the script might have helped to maintain, kept the bricks consistent. Whatever that something was, it is part of what the undeciphered script might tell us, if only it could be read. At its peak, between approximately 2600 and 1900 BCE, the Indus civilization covered an area of around 1 million square kilometers, roughly the size of modern Pakistan and northwestern India combined. It contained hundreds of settlements, ranging from large cities to small villages, connected by trade routes that carried goods across the entire extent of the civilization and beyond, to Mesopotamia and the Persian Gulf. The two largest known cities, Mohenjo-Daro in the south and Harappa in the north, each had populations estimated at between 20,000 and 50,000 people, figures that would make them among the largest cities in the ancient world at their time. And this enormous, sophisticated, extensively connected civilization left behind a written record that no one alive today has been able to read. That gap, between the scale of the civilization and the completeness of the silence it left, is the starting point for everything that follows. To understand why some ancient scripts have been deciphered and others have not, it is necessary to understand something about what decipherment actually requires, and how much depends on luck as much as skill. The great decipherments of the past 2 centuries, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Mesopotamian cuneiform, Linear B, Mayan glyphs, all share a common feature. They were unlocked not purely by analytical brilliance, but by the availability of specific types of evidence that made the analytical work possible. The Rosetta Stone, discovered by French soldiers in Egypt in 1799, provided the key to hieroglyphics because it contained the same text in 3 scripts, hieroglyphics, Demotic, and Ancient Greek, and because the Greek text was fully understood. The names of known pharaohs, readable in the Greek version, gave scholars their first purchase on the hieroglyphic system, and from there the decipherment could proceed step by step. Without the Rosetta Stone, or something equivalent to it, Egyptian hieroglyphics might still be unread today. Linear B, the script of Mycenaean Greece, was deciphered in 1952 by a British architect named Michael Ventris who had been fascinated by it since childhood. Ventris succeeded where professional classicists had failed for decades because he approached the problem with fresh methods, particularly the analysis of the statistical distribution of signs and their positional patterns, and because he made a crucial intuitive leap, the hypothesis that the language encoded in Linear B might be an early form of Greek. When he tested that hypothesis against the structure of the known sign patterns, it worked. The decipherment clicked into place with a speed that surprised even Ventris himself. But the hypothesis that worked, that Linear B encoded Greek, was not obviously correct in advance. It was a guess, a brilliant and well-informed guess, that happened to be right. If the language of the Mycenaean palace culture had been something other than Greek, Ventris's method would have failed, and Linear B might still be undeciphered. The Mayan script presented a different kind of challenge. For most of the 20th century, the academic consensus held that Mayan writing was primarily logographic, a system in which each sign represented a word or concept, rather than phonetic. That consensus was wrong, and it delayed decipherment by decades. The Russian linguist Yuri Norizov demonstrated in the 1950s that Mayan writing was in fact largely syllabic, that signs could represent sounds as well as concepts, but his work was initially dismissed in the West, partly because of Cold War politics and partly because of the institutional weight of the established consensus. Only in the 1970s and 1980s, as a new generation of scholars applied Norizov's methods and built on his insights, did the decipherment of the Mayan script accelerate to the point where large portions of it became readable. Today, approximately 90% of the known Mayan inscriptions can be read. The Mayan case is instructive for another reason. It shows that the failure to decipher a script is not always a failure of analytical method alone. Sometimes it is a failure of institutional imagination, a collective resistance to new approaches that comes from the investment of established scholars in existing frameworks. The Indus script community has not been immune to this problem. Proposed decipherments that challenge the dominant hypotheses have sometimes been dismissed without the careful engagement they deserve, and the dominant hypotheses have sometimes been defended with a certainty that is not warranted by the evidence. The sociology of scholarship, the dynamics of prestige, publication, peer review, and institutional gatekeeping, affects the progress of decipherment research just as it affects progress in any other academic field. And in a field where progress has been so frustratingly slow, the pressures to conform to established positions and the temptations to overstate the strength of one's own findings are both unusually intense. What all three successful decipherments have in common is a combination of three things: a large corpus of text, the ability to identify at least some proper names or known words within the corpus, and knowledge of the language that the script encodes, or a close enough relative of it to provide a starting point. The undeciphered scripts, the Indus script, Linear A, Proto-Elamite, and the others, are undeciphered precisely because one or more of these conditions is missing. The absence of proper names is particularly crippling. In the decipherment of hieroglyphics, the names of pharaohs were the key that unlocked the system. The cartouches, the oval rings that enclosed royal names, were identified as such by Champollion and others, and the known names of rulers like Ptolemy and Cleopatra, readable in the Greek portions of the Rosetta Stone, provided the phonetic values that allowed the rest of the script to be worked out. In Linear B, the geographical names of known Mycenaean sites, Knossos, Amnisos, and others, provided a similar foothold. In the Indus script, there are no known proper names. The inscriptions on the seals do not obviously contain the names of rulers or cities or deities, or if they do, we have no independent record of what those names were. We are trying to decode a message without any of the context that would allow us to begin. It is as if someone handed you a ciphertext with no key, no crib, no known plaintext, and no knowledge of what language the original was written in, and asked you to tell them what it said. The Indus Valley Civilization, which flourished in what is now Pakistan and northwestern India between approximately 3000–1500 BCE, was one of the most remarkable cultures of the ancient world, and one of the most enigmatic. At its height, between approximately 2600 and 1900 BCE, the Indus civilization was the largest of the three great early urban civilizations, exceeding in geographical extent both ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia. Its cities were planned with a regularity and sophistication that was not matched in Europe until the Roman period. The streets of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa ran in a grid pattern, with the main streets wide enough for carts to pass each other. Houses were built from standardized baked bricks, the same size throughout the civilization, across hundreds of kilometers, and most houses had access to a drainage system that carried wastewater away from residential areas through covered channels. The cities had public baths, granaries, and workshops for the production of goods that were traded as far away as Mesopotamia. A standardized system of weights and measures, consistent across the entire civilization, facilitated commerce across its enormous extent. And yet the Indus civilization left almost no monuments of the kind that characterize other ancient civilizations. There are no pyramids, no temples of colossal scale, no royal tombs filled with treasure, no victory steely recording the conquests of kings. The objects recovered from Indus sites are mostly small and practical. The famous soapstone seals, pottery, tools, jewelry, small figurines. The society appears to have been remarkably egalitarian by ancient standards. There is no clear evidence of a ruling class, no obvious palaces, no obvious distinction between elite burials and ordinary ones. How this complex civilization was organized and governed, how decisions were made, who held authority, what beliefs and rituals shaped daily life, are questions that the archaeological record has not answered. The script that this civilization left behind appears on approximately 5,000 known objects, the overwhelming majority of which are the small carved seals, typically about 2 centimeters square, that were probably used to mark ownership or authenticate goods in trade. The inscriptions on these seals are, with very few exceptions, extremely short. The average inscription contains about 5 signs. The longest known inscription contains only 26 signs. That brevity is one of the most serious obstacles to decipherment. There simply is not enough text in any individual inscription to apply the statistical methods that worked for longer texts, and the total corpus, while containing thousands of objects, contains relatively little repetition of long sequences that would allow patterns to emerge clearly. The animals depicted on the Indus seals are among the most recognizable and most discussed features of the Indus material record. Each seal typically combines an inscription with an image, most often an animal, though geometric and composite figures also appear. The animals include cattle, elephants, rhinoceroses, tigers, water buffalo, and the mysterious unicorn, a creature shown in profile with a single horn, which most scholars now believe is a realistic depiction of a one-horned Indian rhinoceros or of a bull shown in profile with its 2 horns appearing as one. These animals were clearly significant. The consistency with which they appear across the entire civilization, on seals made in different cities separated by hundreds of kilometers, suggests a shared iconographic vocabulary that was meaningful and standardized. But what the animals mean in relation to the inscriptions, whether they identify the owner of the seal by clan or guild or religious affiliation, whether they represent deities or protective spirits or something else entirely, is unknown. The images and the text sit together on the seals in a relationship that we can see but cannot understand. The language that the Indus script encodes is completely unknown. The descendants of the Indus civilization, if any direct cultural descendants can be identified, do not speak a language that has been clearly linked to any features of the script. The Dravidian languages, spoken today by hundreds of millions of people in southern India, are the most commonly proposed candidate, on the grounds that they are geographically proximate and have no known origin outside the subcontinent. But the evidence for a Dravidian connection remains circumstantial, and the hypothesis remains contested. Without knowing what language the script encodes, decipherment must proceed by pattern analysis alone, and the patterns in a corpus of 5-sign inscriptions are not enough. What makes this situation particularly frustrating is that the Indus civilization was clearly not isolated. Its trading relationships with Mesopotamia are documented by Indus seals found in Mesopotamian cities and by Mesopotamian records that mention a trading partner called Meluha, a name that most scholars identify with the Indus region. The Mesopotamians knew who the Indus people were. They traded with them, they bought their goods. Some of their people may have lived in Mesopotamian cities. And yet the Mesopotamian records leave no trace of what language the Indus people spoke or what their writing system meant. The ancient equivalent of a translator's notes, the kind of cross-linguistic documentation that would have made decipherment possible, simply did not survive or was never made in the first place. The 2 civilizations coexisted and traded without leaving behind the bilingual key that modern scholars desperately need. Linear A is the writing system of the Minoan civilization of Bronze Age Crete, and its undeciphered status is particularly tantalizing because of its relationship to Linear B. Linear B, as described earlier, was deciphered in 1952 and found to encode Mycenaean Greek. Linear B was derived from Linear A. The 2 scripts share many signs, and Linear B appears to have been adapted by Mycenaean Greeks who took over the palace culture of Crete after the Minoan civilization declined around 1500 BCE. Approximately 100 of the signs in Linear B have clear counterparts in Linear A, and because Linear B is deciphered, scholars know the phonetic values of those signs in that system. The tantalizing possibility is that the same phonetic values might apply in Linear A, that the borrowed signs carried their sound values with them when the Mycenaeans adapted the script for their own use. In practice, This has not led to decipherment. When the known linear B phonetic values are applied to linear A signs, the resulting readings produce sequences of sounds that do not correspond to any known language. The language of linear A, the language of the Minoans, appears to be unrelated to Greek, to any other Indo-European language, and to the other languages of the ancient Mediterranean world. It is, in the technical terminology of linguistics, a language isolate, a language with no known relatives. And a language isolate cannot be approached through comparison with related languages, which removes one of the most powerful tools available to historical linguists. The Minoan civilization is, in itself, one of the most fascinating and mysterious cultures of the ancient world. It was centered on the island of Crete and reached its height between approximately 2000–1500 BCE, when the great palace complexes of Knossos, Phaistos, Malea, and Zakros were the centers of a sophisticated society with elaborate art, complex religion, and far-reaching trade networks that connected it to Egypt, the Levant, and the Aegean Islands. The Minoans left behind extraordinary frescoes showing scenes of daily life, religious ceremony, and the famous bull-leaping ritual that has fascinated scholars and artists since its rediscovery. They left behind pottery of extraordinary elegance and skill. And they left behind, in Linear A, a written record that no one can read. The corpus of Linear A texts is larger than the Indus script corpus in terms of sign variety but smaller in terms of total inscriptions. Approximately 1,500 known inscriptions, found on clay tablets, stone vessels, pottery, and other objects from the palace sites and from other locations across Crete and the Aegean. The tablets from the Palace of Hagia Triada, the largest single group of Linear A documents, appear to be administrative records, lists of goods, accounting entries, inventories, similar in function to the Linear B tablets that record the administrative activities of the Mycenaean palaces. But the language in which those records are written remains, after decades of the most sophisticated analysis available, completely opaque. The Minoan civilization's end is itself a mystery layered on top of the mystery of its script. Around 1500 BCE, the great Minoan palaces were destroyed, some by fire, some apparently abandoned. The precise cause of this catastrophe has been debated by archaeologists for a century. The eruption of the volcano on the island of Thera, modern Santorini, about 100 kilometers north of Crete, is the most famous candidate, and the geological evidence confirms that the Dharan eruption was one of the largest volcanic events in human history, producing a caldera collapse that sent tsunamis across the eastern Mediterranean and ejected enough ash into the atmosphere to affect climate across the region for years. But the dating of the eruption, which has been contested between approximately 1700 and 1500 BCE using different dating methods, makes the relationship between the eruption and the palace destructions uncertain. What is clear is that the Minoan palace culture did not survive. After 1500 BCE, Crete was increasingly under the influence of Mycenaean Greeks, and Linear A gave way to Linear B. The language of the Minoans retreated and then disappeared, leaving only its script as evidence that it had ever existed. The cultural memory of the Minoans that survived into the classical Greek period was fragmentary and mythologized beyond recognition. The Greeks knew that Crete had once been powerful. Their myths told of Minos, the king of Crete who had demanded tribute of young Athenians to feed the Minotaur in its labyrinth. But the Minos of Greek mythology bears only the vaguest resemblance to any specific historical ruler, and the labyrinth of the myth is probably a distorted memory of the complex, multi-roomed palace at Knossos rather than a literal underground maze. By the time the great Athenian historians were writing, the detailed knowledge of Minoan civilization that might have explained what Linear A said was already lost, absorbed into mythology, compressed into symbol, stripped of the specificity that would have made it useful for historical reconstruction. The Minoans left their script, and the Greeks turned them into legend. What was lost in that transformation? The actual names, the actual words, the actual content of what was written in Linear A, is the kind of loss that no myth can compensate for. Proto-Elamite is the oldest undeciphered writing system in the world, and its existence raises questions about the very origins of writing itself. The Elamite civilization was centered in what is now southwestern Iran, in the region known in antiquity as Elam, and it was one of the earliest and most sophisticated civilizations of the ancient Near East. Its capital, Susa, was one of the largest cities of the ancient world at various periods, and Elamite culture maintained a complex relationship with the neighboring civilizations of Mesopotamia. Sometimes at war, sometimes at peace, sometimes culturally dominant and sometimes dominated. A later form of the Elamite language, known simply as Elamite, is partially understood. It appears on inscriptions alongside Akkadian and Old Persian in the trilingual inscriptions of the Persian Empire, which gave scholars enough information to achieve a partial decipherment. But the earlier script, Proto-Elamite, is a different matter entirely. Proto-Elamite dates from approximately 3200 to 2900 BCE, making it roughly contemporary with the earliest Sumerian cuneiform and the earliest Egyptian hieroglyphics. Approximately 10,000 Proto-Elamite tablets are known, making it a larger corpus than either Linear A or the Indus script. The tablets appear to be administrative records, accounting documents similar to the earliest Sumerian texts, recording the movement of goods and the administration of temple estates. Despite this large corpus and the clear administrative function of the documents, Proto-Elamite has resisted decipherment for reasons that are themselves illuminating about the nature of early writing. The fundamental problem is that Proto-Elamite appears to be a highly inconsistent script. The same concept is written in different ways in different tablets, suggesting either that multiple scribal traditions existed simultaneously, or that the signs were used with considerable flexibility that made their exact values difficult to pin down, or that the script was never fully standardized in the way that later writing systems were. Many of the signs appear to be logograms, symbols that represent a word or concept rather than a sound, which makes statistical analysis of the kind that works for phonetic scripts much less effective. And the language that Proto-Elamite encoded is unknown. Whether it was an early form of Elamite, some other language spoken in the region, or a purely administrative notation system with no direct connection to spoken language at all is a question that the inscriptions themselves cannot currently answer. The existence of Proto-Elamite alongside the earliest Sumerian writing raises an important question about the origins of the writing impulse itself. Did writing develop independently in Elam and Mesopotamia, or did one tradition inspire the other? The geographical proximity of the two regions and the clear administrative similarity of the earliest texts in both systems suggests contact and possible influence. But the scripts themselves are sufficiently different that independent invention cannot be ruled out. The question of whether writing was invented once or multiple times, and if multiple times, how often and under what circumstances, is one that the undeciphered scripts of the ancient world make both more urgent and more difficult to answer. The earliest writing systems known to scholars, Sumerian cuneiform, Egyptian hieroglyphics, Proto-Elamite, and the Indus script, all emerged within a few centuries of each other, between approximately 3,500 and 3000 BCE. That near simultaneity has been interpreted in different ways. Some scholars argue that writing was invented once, most likely in Mesopotamia, and spread from there to other civilizations through trade and cultural contact. Others argue that the specific forms of the scripts are too different from each other for a single origin to be plausible, and that writing emerged independently in several places in response to the similar pressures of urban administration and long-distance trade. The truth is probably somewhere in between. The idea of using marks to record information may have spread from a single source, while the specific forms of the scripts were developed independently in each tradition. But the evidence for resolving this question is limited by exactly the kind of loss that the undeciphered scripts represent. We know that early writing existed in several places, but we cannot fully read what it said or trace its development in the detail that would allow us to settle the question of origins. Proto-Elamite's position in the story of writing's origins makes it one of the most consequential of the undeciphered scripts. If writing was invented multiple times independently, then Proto-Elamite represents one of those independent inventions, a human mind, or a community of human minds, arriving at the solution of using marks to record information without being shown how by another tradition. If writing spread from a single origin, then Proto-Elamite represents the earliest stages of that spread, when the idea of writing had been received from another culture but had not yet been fully adapted to the specific needs and language of its new users. Either interpretation has profound implications for our understanding of human cognitive and cultural evolution. Writing is, after all, one of the most significant technologies in human history. Arguably the technology that makes all other technological accumulation possible by allowing knowledge to be stored and transmitted outside of individual memory. Understanding how and why it appeared is one of the most important questions that the study of ancient civilizations can address. And the silence of Proto-Elamite is a major obstacle to answering it. Beyond the three major undeciphered scripts, Indus, Linear A, and Proto-Elamite, there is a wider world of lost and partially understood writing systems that forms a map of the silences in the ancient record. The Rongo-Rongo script of Easter Island is one of the most isolated and mysterious writing systems ever discovered. Rongo-Rongo consists of rows of small carved figures, humans, animals, plants, geometric shapes, inscribed on wooden tablets found on Easter Island in the 19th century. The script was still in use when European contact with the island was first made, but the cultural disruption of the 19th century, slave raids, epidemics, and the destruction of traditional social structures, eliminated the community of people who could read it before any systematic effort at documentation was made. A handful of surviving tablets contain text that no living person has ever been able to interpret. Whether Rongo-Rongo was a true writing system, capable of encoding any statement in the language of its users, or a more limited mnemonic device is itself uncertain. The Voynich manuscript, discovered in the early 20th century and dated by radiocarbon analysis to the early 15th century, contains text in an unknown script illustrated with bizarre drawings of plants, astronomical diagrams, and bathing figures that have no clear counterparts in any known tradition. Despite decades of effort by cryptographers, linguists, and computational analysts, including teams working at the National Security Agency and other code-breaking institutions, the Voynich manuscript has not been deciphered. Some researchers believe it is a genuine language or code. Others believe it is an elaborate hoax or a meaningless construction designed to appear meaningful. The debate remains unresolved, and the manuscript remains unread. The Phaistos disc, found in 1908 in the Minoan Palace of Phaistos on Crete, is a fired clay disc about 15 centimeters in diameter covered on both sides with stamped symbols arranged in a spiral. The symbols, 45 distinct signs, arranged in a sequence of 242, were produced by pressing preformed stamps into the clay, making the disc perhaps the earliest known example of a reproducible printing process. The disc has attracted more proposed decipherments than almost any other short text in the ancient world, with suggestions ranging from a prayer to a hymn to a game board to a calendar. None of these proposals has achieved scholarly consensus, and the disc remains, despite its fame, completely uninterpreted. What connects all of these silences, the Indus script, Linear A, Proto-Elamite, Rongo-Rongo, the Voynich manuscript, the Phaistos disc, is not just the failure of decipherment but what that failure reveals about the fragility of knowledge and the conditions under which it survives. Each of these systems was once fully understood by a community of people who used it every day. Each became opaque because of catastrophe, the collapse of a civilization, the disruption of a community, the destruction of a tradition, that severed the chain of transmission before the knowledge could be secured in some other form. The loss of a writing system is always, at its core, the loss of the people who used it. There is one more undeciphered script that deserves mention because it was nearly deciphered, and then the knowledge slipped away again. The Cypro-Minoan script was used on the island of Cyprus from approximately 1600 to 1000 BCE. It is clearly related to Linear A. The signs are similar in form, but Cypro-Minoan has not been deciphered, despite the fact that its descendant, the classical Cypriot syllabary, is fully understood. Applying those phonetic values to Cypro-Minoan produces partial readings that look plausible for some inscriptions and nonsensical for others, suggesting the language of Cypro-Minoan may be different from the Greek that the classical Cypriot syllabary was used to write. Cyprus, positioned between the Aegean and the Levant, was a crossroads of ancient cultures. The possibility that Cypro-Minoan records a language from that crossroads that has left no other trace adds yet another layer to the puzzle of Bronze Age writing systems. The broader pattern that emerges from this survey of undeciphered and lost scripts is one of extraordinary richness followed by catastrophic simplification. The ancient world, between approximately 3,500 and 1000 BCE, contained a remarkable diversity of writing systems. Systems that encoded different languages, operated on different principles, and served different functions within different social contexts. Most of that diversity was eliminated by the Bronze Age collapse, by the subsequent spread of alphabetic writing systems descended from the Phoenician alphabet, and by the political and cultural dominance of the civilizations that survived the collapse. What we are left with is a world in which the vast majority of written language is alphabetic, descended from a single tradition, and a collection of silent scripts that are the remnants of the richer, stranger, more varied world of ancient literacy that preceded it. The question of why the Indus civilization collapsed, and whether its collapse is related to the disappearance of its script, is one of the most actively debated questions in South Asian archaeology. The decline of the Indus civilization was not sudden. Between approximately 1900 and 1500 BCE, the great urban centers of Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa were gradually abandoned. Population shifted eastward, toward the Gangetic Plain and the foothills of the Himalayas. The standardized brick construction declined. The system of weights and measures fell out of use. Long-distance trade contracted. The script, which had been used consistently across the entire civilization during its peak, appears in the archaeological record with decreasing frequency and then disappears entirely. By the end of the second millennium BCE, the urban Indus civilization had ceased to exist in any form that is recognizable from the archaeological evidence. The causes of this decline have been debated since the Indus civilization was first systematically excavated. The earliest proposed explanation, an invasion by Indo-Aryan peoples from the north and west, suggested by some scholars who linked the decline to the migrations described in the Vedic texts, has been largely abandoned as an explanation for the initial urban collapse. Though the relationship between the Indus civilization and the subsequent cultures of the subcontinent remains a subject of intense scholarly and political debate. The most widely accepted current explanation emphasizes environmental factors, a prolonged period of drought linked to a weakening of the monsoon system that made the intensive agriculture supporting the large urban populations increasingly difficult to sustain. Evidence from isotopic analysis of sediments and from the distribution of archaeological sites is consistent with a gradual drying of the climate in the Indus region during the second millennium BCE. If the collapse of the Indus civilization was primarily driven by environmental stress, by a climate shift that reduced rainfall, dried rivers, and made the region progressively less able to support its population, then the loss of the script is a consequence of the loss of the urban social structure that used it. Writing systems do not survive in isolation. They survive as part of living communities of practice, maintained by scribes who learn the script from teachers who learned it from their teachers, in an unbroken chain of transmission. When the cities of the Indus were abandoned and the population dispersed into smaller and more mobile communities, that chain was broken. The script lost its institutional context, the palaces, the workshops, the trade networks that had given it its function, and without function, the knowledge of how to use it faded within a generation or two. That pattern, The loss of a writing system as a consequence of the loss of the social structure that sustained it is not unique to the Indus civilization. It is visible in the disappearance of Linear A with the decline of Minoan palace culture, in the near disappearance of Linear B when the Mycenaean palace culture collapsed at the end of the Bronze Age, and in the loss of many other writing systems throughout history. Writing is not a natural human capacity. It is a technology maintained by specific institutions, and it is as vulnerable to collapse as any other complex technology. The collapse of the Mycenaean palace culture around 1200 BCE, part of the broader Bronze Age collapse that destroyed or severely disrupted nearly every major civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean within the space of a few decades, is one of history's most dramatic demonstrations of this vulnerability. Linear B, the script of the Mycenaean palaces, vanished almost completely when the palaces were destroyed. The palace administrators who used the script to record their inventories, their tribute lists, their personnel records, they died or dispersed, and with them went the institutional context that made the script functional. For approximately 400 years after the palace collapse, the Greek-speaking world had no writing at all. When writing returned to Greece, it was in the form of the Phoenician alphabet, a completely different system from Linear B, adopted from a different cultural tradition entirely. Linear B was so thoroughly lost that no one in the classical Greek world had any awareness that it had ever existed. It was rediscovered only in the 20th century, millennia after the last person who could read it had died. The 400-year gap in Greek literacy is itself a profound historical fact. Everything that happened in the Greek world during those centuries, the movements of peoples, the development of oral traditions that would eventually be written down as the Iliad and the Odyssey, the social and cultural changes that produced the classical civilization, occurred without written records. We know about it only through the fragmentary evidence of archaeology and through the echoes preserved in the oral traditions that survived into the literate period. It is a reminder that the written record, which historians rely on so heavily, is not a continuous or complete account of the past. It is a patchwork of preserved fragments, with enormous gaps where the conditions for preservation did not exist. The computational approaches to undeciphered scripts represent the frontier of current decipherment research, and they have produced results that are both promising and sobering. Machine learning and statistical analysis have been applied to the Indus script since the 1970s, when early computer analysis of the sign sequences revealed patterns consistent with a structured linguistic system rather than a purely accounting notation. More recent applications of natural language processing algorithms, the same class of algorithms that underlies modern machine translation and text analysis, have produced more sophisticated analyses of the structural properties of the script. These analyses have confirmed that the Indus script has the statistical signature of a linguistic system. The distribution of signs, the patterns of sign combination, the positional regularities, all are consistent with what one would expect from a system encoding language and inconsistent with what one would expect from a purely accounting notation or a random sequence. That finding, that the Indus script is structurally consistent with being a language, is significant because it rules out one class of skeptical argument. The claim that the script is not a true writing system at all, but merely a set of symbols with limited, non-linguistic meanings, like maker's marks or clan symbols. The statistical evidence suggests that the script encodes something with the complexity and structure of natural language. But it does not tell us what language, and it cannot substitute for the kind of bilingual inscription or known proper name that allowed the successful decipherments of the past to proceed. The most ambitious recent computational project involving the Indus script used machine learning algorithms trained on a large number of known writing systems to analyze the structural properties of the Indus signs and compare them with the structural properties of other scripts. The project found that the Indus script's structural properties were most similar to those of Dravidian language writing systems, providing computational support for the hypothesis that the script encodes a Dravidian language. But the researchers were careful to note that their finding was a correlation, not a decipherment. It suggested a direction for further investigation, not a solution. The fundamental limitation of computational approaches is the same limitation that faces all decipherment attempts in the absence of a bilingual text. Without knowing what the script says, no amount of structural analysis can determine the phonetic values of the signs. Pattern recognition can reveal that certain signs appear frequently in certain positions, that certain sequences are common and others rare, that the script has properties consistent with linguistic encoding. But it cannot, from those observations alone, determine what sounds the signs represent or what words they spell. The Rosetta Stone was not a computational tool. It was a lucky accident of preservation. And no equivalent accident has yet been found for the Indus script. The statistical debate about the Indus script has one more dimension worth examining. Whether it is a script at all in the full linguistic sense or a more limited notation system. Researchers like Steve Farmer, Richard Sproat, and Michael Witzel have argued that the Indus script does not encode language in the way that true writing systems do, that it may instead be a set of non-linguistic symbols, perhaps religious or political emblems, owner's marks, or a complex heraldic system. If correct, the script cannot be deciphered in the conventional sense because there is no language underneath it to decode. The debate between the linguistic and non-linguistic camps is fundamental and unresolved. The statistical evidence admits of multiple interpretations, and the physical evidence does not clearly distinguish between the two hypotheses. It is possible that the Indus script is a writing system waiting to be deciphered. It is also possible that it is something else entirely. There is, however, one computational result that has attracted particular attention and generated significant controversy. A team of researchers from the University of Washington published a study in 2009 claiming that statistical analysis of the Indus script showed that its sign sequences had the properties of a linguistic system encoding natural language. Specifically, that the conditional entropy of the sign sequences fell within the range characteristic of natural languages rather than the range characteristic of non-linguistic systems like music or computer code. The paper was published in a high-profile science journal and received wide coverage in the popular press as evidence that the Indus script encoded a true language. Critics pointed out that the statistical methods used in the paper could not distinguish between a linguistic system and a non-linguistic system that mimicked the structural properties of language, that the results showed what the script was consistent with, not what it actually was. The debate that followed illustrated both the promise and the limitations of computational approaches to undeciphered scripts. The promise that new quantitative methods might reveal structural properties invisible to traditional analysis, and the limitation that structural analysis alone cannot substitute for the external evidence, the bilingual text, the known proper name, the lucky find, that successful decipherments have always required. The political dimensions of the Indus script debate are as complex as the linguistic ones, and they have sometimes made the search for understanding harder rather than easier. The Indus Valley Civilization occupies a central place in the competing narratives about the origins of South Asian civilization. In the century since its discovery, it has been claimed as an ancestor by various national and cultural traditions, used as evidence in debates about the origins of the Hindu religion, invoked in arguments about the linguistic prehistory of the subcontinent, and positioned as a counterweight to narratives that locate the origins of Indian civilization in the Aryan migrations from Central Asia. These debates are not merely academic. They touch on questions of cultural identity, political legitimacy, and the historical claims of different communities within one of the world's most populous and culturally complex regions. In that charged context, the undeciphered Indus script has sometimes become a screen onto which competing desires are projected. The hypothesis that the script encodes a Dravidian language is attractive to those who wish to establish a pre-Aryan, indigenous origin for South Asian civilization. The hypothesis that it encodes a Proto-Indo-Aryan language is attractive to those who wish to connect the Indus civilization directly to the Vedic tradition. Neither hypothesis is supported by evidence strong enough to compel agreement, and the weakness of the evidence has allowed both to persist as politically motivated preferences as much as scholarly arguments. That politicization is not unique to the Indus script. The history of ancient writing systems is filled with cases in which decipherment claims have been shaped by nationalist or ideological agendas. But it is particularly acute in the Indus case, because the script remains genuinely undeciphered and therefore genuinely open to competing interpretations. When a script is fully deciphered, the political uses that can be made of it are constrained by what it actually says. When a script is undeciphered, it can be made to say whatever its interpreters wish, and the wish is sometimes stronger than the evidence. The best decipherment scholarship has tried to insulate itself from these pressures by focusing on the internal evidence of the script itself, the statistical properties of the signs, the patterns of their distribution, the constraints that the structural analysis places on possible interpretations, rather than on the external political or ideological arguments about what the script should say. That insulation is never complete, because scholars are human beings operating within cultural and political contexts that inevitably shape their assumptions and preferences. But the attempt to ground the argument in the evidence is the right one, and it is the approach most likely to eventually produce genuine understanding. The nationalization of the Indus civilization as cultural heritage by the modern states of India and Pakistan has added a further layer of complexity to the political dimensions of the decipherment debate. The major Indus sites are distributed between the two countries. Mohenjo-Daro is in Pakistan's Sindh province, Harappa is in Pakistan's Punjab, and many important sites including Dhalavira are in India's Gujarat state. The intellectual and scholarly communities of the two countries have sometimes approached the Indus civilization from different perspectives, shaped by their different relationships to the historical and cultural claims that the civilization is used to support. Archaeological access and data sharing between the two countries has been affected by the political relationship between them, which has been tense and sometimes hostile. The result is that the most important ancient civilization of the subcontinent is studied within a framework of national competition as much as international scholarly collaboration, and that framework has not been conducive to the kind of open, cumulative scientific progress that decipherment requires. The specific question of the Aryan migration, whether the Indo-European languages of South Asia arrived with migrants from Central Asia, displacing or absorbing the pre-existing populations and languages of the subcontinent, or whether they developed in place, is one that the Indus script is directly relevant to, if only it could be read. If the Indus script encodes a Dravidian language, it is evidence that the pre-Aryan population of northwestern India spoke a Dravidian language, a language family that is now spoken primarily in southern India, which would imply that the Aryan migrations pushed Dravidian speakers southward. If it encodes an Indo-Aryan language, it would push back the date of Indo-Aryan presence in the subcontinent by at least a millennium and challenge the migration hypothesis entirely. These are not merely academic questions. They are questions with direct implications for the cultural and political identity of hundreds of millions of people. The pressure to produce a decipherment that supports one answer or the other is real, and it has not always been resisted as firmly as the integrity of the scholarship requires. The loss of a language is not merely the loss of a communication system. It is the loss of a way of organizing experience, a particular structure of categories, relationships, and distinctions that shapes how the world is perceived and understood by those who use it. Linguists have debated for decades the extent to which language determines thought, the question known as the Sapir-Whorf hypothesis, after the two American linguists who most influentially argued for it in the early 20th century. The strong version of the hypothesis, that language completely determines what thoughts are possible, is now generally rejected. The weak version, that language influences thought, shaping habits of attention and patterns of categorization in ways that are real but not absolute, is more widely accepted, and it has been supported by a growing body of experimental evidence. Languages differ in the distinctions they make obligatory. Some languages require speakers to specify the direction of movement whenever they describe motion. Others require specification of whether something was witnessed directly or reported by others. Still others encode the relative social status of speaker and addressee in every verb form. These differences are not merely stylistic, They reflect and reinforce different ways of paying attention to the world. When a language dies, the particular way of attending to the world that it encoded dies with it. This is true of languages that have living speakers who remember their decline. The indigenous languages of the Americas, of Australia, of Africa, that have been reduced to a handful of elderly speakers in the past century by the pressures of colonialism, forced education, and cultural marginalization. The loss of those languages is a loss that is felt and mourned by their communities. But the loss of the languages encoded in the undeciphered scripts is different in character. It is a loss so complete that we cannot even specify what was lost. We know that the people of the Indus civilization perceived the world in some particular way, that they had words for things that no other language had words for, that they made distinctions that other languages did not make, that their poetry and their prayers and their instructions to their children were shaped by a particular grammatical and lexical architecture. We know this because all languages are particular in this way. But we cannot know what that particularity was, because the language is gone and has left no record that we can read. That unknowing is, in a certain sense, the deepest form of loss. The ruins of Mohenjo-Daro are impressive. The seals with their elegant animal carvings are beautiful. The drainage systems of Harappa speak to an organizational intelligence that commands respect across the millennia. But behind all of those physical remains was a living culture. People who told stories, sang songs, argued with their neighbors, taught their children, prayed to their gods in words that expressed their specific understanding of what it meant to be alive in that particular time and place. Those words are gone. The inscriptions that remain are not a window into that inner life but a wall, the evidence of a language that existed, without access to what the language contained. There is a particular kind of grief that comes with looking at the Indus seals. They are small objects. You could hold one in the palm of your hand, and they are extraordinarily refined. The images carved into them show animals of great naturalistic precision, a bull with its head lowered, muscles visible beneath the skin, an elephant with every fold of its hide rendered in delicate relief, a rhinoceros with its horn catching the light in a way that suggests it was observed from life. These were made by skilled artisans who knew the animals they depicted, who had looked at them carefully enough to render them with this degree of accuracy, who had the technical skill to translate that observation into this miniature form. And somewhere, somehow, these objects carried meaning beyond their beauty. They were functional, they were used in commerce or administration or ritual, they were part of a living system of communication between people who understood exactly what they said. We can see the skill and the intention. We cannot see the meaning. And that gap, between the evidence of careful thought and the impenetrability of what was thought, is one of the strangest and most affecting experiences that the ancient world has to offer. The Indus seals are now distributed among museums on 3 continents: in Karachi, in New Delhi, in London, in New York. They sit in glass cases, explained by cards that note their date, their origin, and the uncertainty about what they mean. Visitors pause in front of them, look at the animals and the signs, and move on. The seals do not reveal their secrets to casual inspection any more than they do to sustained scholarly analysis. They carry, somewhere within their sequences of signs, information that was once as ordinary as a shipping label, as routine as a signature, as mundane as a receipt. The strangeness is that the ordinary has become inaccessible. The routine has become mysterious. The mundane has become, through the simple accident of the chain of transmission being broken, one of the great unsolved puzzles of human history. The Rongorongo script of Easter Island represents one of the most poignant cases of language loss, because it happened within living memory, and because the community that could have prevented it was present when the knowledge was destroyed. Easter Island, Rapa Nui in the language of its inhabitants, is one of the most remote inhabited places on Earth, located in the southeastern Pacific Ocean more than 3,000 kilometers from the nearest continental landmass. Its inhabitants, who arrived from Polynesia sometime between 800 and 1200 CE, developed a complex and distinctive culture that produced the famous moai, the enormous stone statues that have made the island one of the most recognizable archaeological sites in the world. And at some point in the island's history, the precise date is uncertain, they also developed a script. Rongorongo is inscribed on 24 known objects, most of them wooden tablets, that were collected in the 19th century and are now distributed among museums in Europe, the United States, and Chile. The script consists of rows of small carved figures, humans, birds, fish, plants, geometric shapes, arranged in a boustrophedon pattern, meaning that alternate rows are read in opposite directions, rotating the tablet 180 degrees to read each new line. The figures are carved with considerable skill, suggesting a long tradition of practice, and the inscriptions are dense and consistent in a way that implies a standardized system rather than improvised notation. When European missionaries arrived on Easter Island in the 1860s, they found that Rongorongo was associated with a priestly class whose members could read the tablets and sing the texts they contained. The missionaries, regarding the script as connected to pagan practices, ordered the tablets to be burned. Many were destroyed. Then, in 1862 and 1863, Peruvian slave raiders kidnapped approximately 1,500 Easter Islanders, including almost the entire priestly and chiefly class, the people most likely to have been literate in Rongorongo. Most of those people died in Peru. The few who survived and were repatriated brought smallpox back to the island, killing a large portion of the remaining population. By the time systematic efforts to document the script began in the 1860s and 1870s, there were reportedly only a handful of people left who claimed any knowledge of it, and what they claimed was disputed, inconsistent, and almost certainly incomplete. The window closed within a decade. The knowledge of Rongorongo, which had been maintained by a community of practice across many generations, was eliminated not by the slow erosion of time, but by deliberate destruction and catastrophic demographic collapse in the space of a few years. The tablets that remain are silent because the people who could read them were killed or their descendants were never taught what had been lost. The Easter Island story is one of the clearest and most painful illustrations of a truth that runs through the entire history of undeciphered scripts. The chain of transmission is fragile, and once broken, it cannot be repaired from the outside. The knowledge of Rongorongo was not encoded in the tablets themselves in a way that could be recovered by someone who had never been taught to read them. It was encoded in the minds of the people who had been taught, in the patterns of memory and practice that were built up through years of instruction and use. When those people were gone, the knowledge was gone with them. The tablets that remain are like musical instruments that no one can play. They are obviously objects made for a purpose. They show evidence of great skill and attention. They were clearly meaningful to the people who made them. But without the living tradition that animated them, they are silent. Several researchers in the 19th and 20th centuries attempted to find remaining knowledge of Rongorongo by interviewing elderly Easter Islanders who claimed some connection to the old traditions. Some of those interviews produced accounts of what the tablets contained: genealogies, cosmological narratives, agricultural calendars, accounts of the creation of the world. But the accounts were inconsistent with each other and could not be verified against the tablet texts in any systematic way. Whether the people interviewed were drawing on genuine surviving knowledge, on community memory of what the tablets had once contained, or on imagination shaped by expectation, is impossible to determine. The accounts are tantalizing but not verifiable, and the tablets themselves remain as opaque as ever. The tragedy of Easter Island is a compressed version of the tragedy of the undeciphered scripts more broadly. In most cases, the chain of transmission was broken so long ago, thousands of years in the case of the Indus script or Linear A, that the loss is abstract, historical, something we know about intellectually without being able to feel its full weight. In the case of Rongorongo, the loss happened within living memory of the first systematic attempts to document it. The people who could have preserved the knowledge were alive when European contact was made. Their names, in some cases, are known. The specific decisions, to burn the tablets, to enslave the literate class, to bring disease back from Peru, that eliminated the knowledge can be traced to specific actors in specific years. The loss has a human scale and a human cause that make it feel different from the anonymous catastrophes that silenced the Indus script. The scholarly community that works on undeciphered scripts is small, specialized, and marked by debates that have sometimes become as heated as anything in academic life, because the stakes, in a certain sense, are very high. A successful decipherment of the Indus script, or of Linear A, would be one of the most significant intellectual achievements in the history of scholarship. It would open a window into civilizations that are currently known only through their material remains, civilizations that were, at their height, among the most sophisticated and extensive in the ancient world. It would transform our understanding of the deep past of South Asia, of the Aegean, of the ancient Near East. And it would make the scholar responsible for it famous in a way that few academic achievements can match. The decipherment of an ancient script is the kind of result that reaches beyond the specialist community to capture the attention of a much wider audience. That combination of high stakes and genuine uncertainty has sometimes produced a dynamic in which proposed decipherments are advanced with more confidence than the evidence warrants, defended against criticism with more intensity than is productive, and rejected by skeptics with more dismissiveness than is fair. The history of Indus script decipherment attempts is particularly marked by this dynamic. Dozens of scholars have claimed to have cracked the code, each attracting brief attention before their claims were demolished by specialists who pointed out the ways in which the proposed readings failed to account for the evidence. The pattern has repeated so many times that a kind of institutional skepticism has developed within the specialist community, a presumption against new decipherment claims that, while understandable, may sometimes make it harder for genuinely new insights to receive a fair hearing. The most careful practitioners of decipherment scholarship are those who maintain a clear distinction between what the evidence can support and what they wish it could support, who are willing to say, with precision, what is known and what is not, what is consistent with the evidence and what is inconsistent, what would be required to make further progress and what those requirements seem unlikely to be met by the currently available data. That kind of careful, constrained scholarship is less exciting than a dramatic decipherment claim, but it is more likely to eventually produce genuine understanding. And in the meantime, it serves the important function of keeping the question honest, of preventing the silence of the undeciphered scripts from being filled with the words that scholars want to hear rather than the words that are actually there. The sociology of the decipherment community also creates an unusual relationship between experts and the general public. Most academic fields maintain a reasonably clear boundary between specialist knowledge and popular understanding. In the field of undeciphered scripts, that boundary is more permeable than usual, because the absence of a definitive decipherment means that no professional can claim the authority that comes from having established the correct reading. Into that authority vacuum, amateur decipherers have flowed in large numbers, enthusiastic individuals who have applied their own methods to the Indus script or Linear A and arrived at readings they are convinced are correct. The Internet has dramatically amplified this phenomenon, creating communities of amateur decipherers who share their findings and sometimes attract popular attention that exceeds anything achieved by professional scholarship. Most of these amateur decipherments are, in the judgment of specialists, wrong. They make assumptions not warranted by the evidence and produce readings that do not hold up under scrutiny. But not all amateur contributions to scholarship are wrong. The decipherment of Linear B was achieved by a man whose day job was architecture. And the dismissal of all non-professional contributions is not always as carefully reasoned as it should be. The field of undeciphered scripts exists in an unusual state of suspended judgment, a state in which certainty is impossible, amateur enthusiasm is understandable, and the boundaries between productive speculation and wishful thinking are genuinely difficult to draw. That combination of scholarly rigor and popular fascination is what the undeciphered scripts deserve. They are not just puzzles for specialists. They are evidence of the depth and variety of human intelligence in the ancient world. Every one of these scripts was produced by people solving difficult problems: how to record information, how to maintain consistency across a large organization, how to mark ownership in a world of complex trade. The solutions they arrived at were varied and sophisticated. The fact that we cannot read some of them does not diminish the achievement they represent. It only deepens the mystery and the sense of loss that surrounds them. There is a final irony worth noting. The undeciphered scripts have, in their silence, generated an enormous volume of scholarly literature. Thousands of papers, dozens of books, countless debates. The Indus script has been written about far more than it has been read. All of this constitutes a vast body of writing about writing that no one can read. In a sense, the undeciphered scripts have produced their own literature, their own community of practitioners bound together by a shared engagement with an object that refuses to yield its meaning. That literature will not decipher the scripts. But it is a record of human intellectual persistence, of the refusal to accept that some things cannot be known, of the stubborn conviction that the silence can eventually be broken. Whether or not that conviction is correct, it is a recognizable and admirable human trait. There is a philosophical question lurking beneath all the technical debates about decipherment methods and linguistic hypotheses. A question about what it would even mean to read an undeciphered script, and what we would learn from it if we could. The assumption that motivates decipherment research is that the texts, once read, would tell us something important about the civilizations that produced them. That assumption is reasonable, and the history of successful decipherment supports it. The Linear B tablets, once read, revealed the administrative structure of Mycenaean palace economies in extraordinary detail. The Mayan inscriptions, once read, disclosed the dynastic histories and ritual calendars of the classic Maya cities with a richness that archaeology alone could not have provided. Reading the Indus script would, on this assumption, reveal something comparable about the Indus civilization: its administrative practices, its trade relationships, its religious beliefs, its social structure. But there is a sobering counterexample. Proto-Elamite is a large corpus of administrative documents that, despite remaining undeciphered in the full phonetic sense, has been partially interpreted at a functional level. Scholars can read the tablets in the sense of understanding what they are accounting for, even if they cannot read the words. What those tablets reveal is primarily accounting: lists of goods received and distributed, records of labor and production, tallies of animals and grain. The tablets are extraordinarily valuable as evidence for the economic organization of early Elamite society. But they do not reveal, and would not reveal even if fully deciphered, the kind of rich inner life, the mythology, the poetry, the theology, that historians most want to access. Administrative records are, by their nature, dry. They record the movement of things rather than the movement of thought. If the Indus script is, as the short inscriptions on the seal suggest, primarily a system for marking ownership or authenticating trade goods, if the seals function something like modern logos or hallmarks rather than like texts, then a complete decipherment might reveal less than hoped. The seals might say the equivalent of property of the merchant Harappa or certified for trade by the Guild of Mohenjo-Daro, information that would be historically valuable, but that would not unlock the inner life of the civilization in the way that a library of literary or religious texts would. The long inscriptions that would reveal the mythology and the theology and the poetry of the Indus civilization may never have existed, or may have existed on perishable materials that have not survived. The silence of the Indus script may be, in part, the silence of a people whose deepest thoughts were never committed to durable materials. Thoughts carried in memory, in oral tradition, in perishable writing, and now permanently lost. This possibility, that the surviving Indus inscriptions are not representative of the full range of Indus writing, is one that is sometimes overlooked in the decipherment debate. The inscriptions that survive are those that were inscribed on durable materials: stone, baked clay, copper. If the Indus civilization also used writing on perishable materials, palm leaves, bark, cloth, wooden tablets, that writing is entirely gone, not preserved even in the fragmentary way that the stone and clay inscriptions are preserved. Other ancient civilizations certainly used perishable writing materials alongside durable ones: Egyptian papyrus, Mesopotamian wooden tablets, Chinese bamboo strips. If the Indus civilization used similar materials for its literary, religious, or legal texts, reserving the durable stone and clay for commercial and administrative purposes, then the short seal inscriptions that dominate the surviving corpus may be the most mundane and least informative portion of the original written record. The great texts of the Indus civilization, if they existed, may simply not have survived. We may be attempting to understand an entire civilization from what amounts to its receipts and shipping labels, while its poetry and its prayers have dissolved into the soil of the subcontinent. The analogy to receipts and shipping labels is not merely rhetorical. The earliest cuneiform texts from Mesopotamia, the very first written documents in human history, dating from around 3400 BCE, are exactly that: accounting records, lists of goods received and dispersed, records of rations distributed to workers, tallies of animals in temple herds. The earliest writing was not poetry or philosophy or history. It was bookkeeping. The literary and intellectual uses of writing came later, as the technology matured and its potential was more fully realized. If the Indus script was at a similar stage of development, primarily an administrative tool, not yet widely used for literary or religious purposes, then the brevity of the inscriptions and the absence of longer texts may reflect not a loss of perishable materials but simply the early stage of the writing tradition. The Indus civilization may have been a literate civilization in only the most limited sense, capable of using marks to record administrative information, but not yet in the habit of using writing to record stories, laws, prayers, or the other forms of text that give historians the richest access to the inner life of ancient cultures. That possibility does not make the silence of the Indus script less profound, but it changes its character, from the loss of a rich literary tradition to the archaeological invisibility of a tradition that may not yet have existed in a durable form. The question of what was lost when these scripts became unreadable connects to a larger question about the nature of civilization and what it means for a civilization to survive. Civilizations are often thought of in terms of their physical remains: the monuments, the cities, the objects in museums. Those remains are impressive and they are important, but they are not the civilization itself. A civilization is, at its core, a way of life maintained by a community of people across time, a set of shared practices, beliefs, values, and stories that give meaning to existence and organize cooperation among large numbers of people who do not all know each other personally. The physical remains are the traces that the civilization left behind after the community was gone. They are evidence for what the civilization was, but they are not the civilization itself. When the Indus civilization declined and its cities were abandoned, something more was lost than the buildings and the drainage systems and the standardized weights. What was lost was the community of people who knew what those buildings were for, who used the weights in their daily commerce, who understood the symbols on the seals and what they meant and why they mattered. The civilization ended not when the last building fell, but when the last person who remembered what the buildings had meant to the living community died without passing that knowledge on. The undeciphered scripts are evidence of this deeper loss. They are the most concrete possible reminder that the knowledge contained in a civilization is not automatically preserved by its physical remains, that the meaning of those remains requires a chain of transmission that can be broken, and that when it breaks, what is lost may be irretrievable. The Indus seals are beautiful objects, and they are obviously meaningful. The care with which they were made, the consistency of their production across a vast civilization, the specificity of their imagery all speak to a system of meaning that was important to the people who created it. But the meaning is gone. We can see that the seals meant something. We cannot see what they meant. That gap between the evidence of meaning and access to meaning is the most profound challenge that the undeciphered scripts present. It is not a challenge that more archaeological excavation can necessarily solve, or that better computational methods can necessarily bridge, or that more brilliant scholars working with more sophisticated tools can necessarily overcome. It may be a permanent condition, a permanent record of what was lost when these civilizations ended and their scripts fell silent. And learning to sit with that permanent condition, to acknowledge the depth of the loss without pretending that it can be recovered, may itself be a kind of wisdom. There is an important distinction between two different kinds of historical ignorance. The ignorance that comes from not having found the evidence yet, and the ignorance that comes from the permanent destruction of evidence that once existed. The first kind of ignorance can be addressed by more archaeology, more excavation, more systematic survey of known sites and discovery of unknown ones. The second kind cannot. It is the silence left by fire, by flood, by the ordinary decay of perishable things, by the disruption of communities before they could transmit what they knew. The undeciphered scripts sit at the boundary between these two kinds of ignorance. It is possible, just possible, that somewhere beneath the soil of Pakistan or India or Crete there is a bilingual inscription waiting to be found, a text that gives scholars the key they need. That possibility is real enough to motivate continued excavation and hope. But it is also possible that no such key exists, that the evidence needed to decipher the script was never made in a durable form, and that the silence is permanent. Living with that uncertainty, neither giving up the search nor deceiving oneself about the probability of success, is the condition of everyone who works seriously on these problems. The search continues nonetheless, and it continues because the stakes are high enough to justify the effort even in the face of low probability. A successful decipherment of the Indus script would be one of the most significant intellectual events of the 21st century. It would open a window into a civilization that was, in its time, one of the largest and most sophisticated on Earth, a civilization that developed independently of the Mediterranean and Mesopotamian traditions that have shaped so much of the conventional historical narrative, that found its own solutions to the problems of urban organization and long-distance trade, that produced its own art and its own symbols and its own ways of marking what mattered. That civilization deserves to be understood on its own terms, not just through the silent evidence of its material remains. And the possibility, however uncertain, that a key to its script might yet be found is a possibility worth pursuing with every tool that scholarship can bring to bear. The excavations continue at Mohenjo-Daro, at Harappa, at Dhalavira and Rakhigarhi and dozens of other sites across the ancient Indus landscape. Each new excavation season brings new objects, new inscriptions, new possibilities. No bilingual text has yet been found, but no one has finished looking. The soil of South Asia is deep, and what it contains is not fully known. Somewhere beneath that soil, perhaps, is the document that changes everything. And in the meantime, the seals sit in their museum cases around the world, patient and silent, waiting for someone to read them. In recent decades, a new generation of approaches to the problem of undeciphered scripts has emerged. Approaches that combine the traditional methods of historical linguistics and epigraphy with the computational tools of the digital age in ways that were not possible for earlier scholars. The digitization of the Indus script corpus, comprehensive databases of all known inscriptions with high-resolution images and standardized sign inventories, has made it possible to apply quantitative methods to the entire corpus simultaneously. Those databases contain records of several thousand inscriptions and have enabled analyses that would have taken decades to perform by hand. They have produced important insights into the structure of the script, confirming its linguistic character, identifying the most common signs and sequences, revealing positional regularities that constrain the range of possible interpretations, even without producing a decipherment. Machine learning approaches have been applied not just to the Indus script but to the general problem of undeciphered scripts, attempting to develop methods that can work without the bilingual texts that successful historical decipherments have relied upon. One approach uses neural networks trained on known writing systems to learn the structural properties that distinguish phonetic scripts from logographic ones and from non-linguistic notation systems, with the goal of applying that classifier to undeciphered scripts to determine which category they belong to. Another approach attempts to identify cognates between an undeciphered script and known scripts by looking for structural similarities that might indicate a historical relationship between the two systems. These approaches are still in early stages, and none has yet produced a decipherment or even a confirmed partial reading. But they represent a genuinely new toolkit that was not available to previous generations of scholars. The prospect of artificial intelligence contributing to the decipherment of ancient scripts has attracted both enthusiasm and skepticism. The enthusiasm is understandable. If machine learning can learn to translate between modern languages with no bilingual training data, as recent neural translation systems have demonstrated in limited contexts, might it not be able to find structure in undeciphered ancient scripts that human analysts have missed? The skepticism is also understandable. The challenge of undeciphered scripts is not primarily a problem of pattern recognition, for which machine learning is well suited, but a problem of semantic grounding, connecting the patterns to meanings, for which no amount of structural analysis can substitute in the absence of external reference points. The patterns in the Indus script are visible. What the patterns mean is not accessible from the patterns alone. One area where AI approaches have shown genuine promise is not decipherment itself, but reconstruction of damaged texts. Machine learning models trained on known ancient scripts can predict missing signs in damaged inscriptions with accuracy that sometimes exceeds human experts, not because the machine understands the language, but because it has learned the statistical patterns of sign co-occurrence. For undeciphered scripts, this cannot directly advance decipherment, but it can improve the corpus available for analysis by filling in partially damaged inscriptions. The most significant recent development in the intersection of artificial intelligence and ancient writing is the decipherment of a previously unreadable cuneiform dialect from ancient Ugarit, where neural network analysis identified patterns that human scholars had missed over decades of study. That result, achieved in a case where the language family was known, which made the problem fundamentally more tractable than the undeciphered scripts, suggests that AI tools may have a genuine role to play in the future of ancient language research. But it also underscores the importance of the conditions that made that success possible: a large corpus, knowledge of the language family, and the availability of related texts for comparison. For the truly undeciphered scripts, those conditions do not exist, and no amount of computational sophistication can manufacture them from the available data. The question of what new evidence might emerge from continued archaeological work is one that keeps hope alive in the decipherment community. The subcontinent of South Asia remains incompletely excavated. The known Indus sites represent only a fraction of what almost certainly existed, and the discovery of new sites in recent decades has already significantly expanded the corpus of known inscriptions. D'Oliveira, excavated primarily in the 1990s and 2000s, produced a remarkable inscription of 10 large signs displayed on what appears to have been a public board at the entrance to the city. The largest Indus sign sequence found in situ, displayed in a context that suggests it was meant to be read by passers-by. That inscription has not been deciphered, but its existence proves that the Indus script was used for public communication as well as for private seals, and it raises the possibility that other large, publicly displayed texts might yet be found at sites not yet excavated. Rakhigarhi in Haryana, potentially the largest Indus city yet identified, is only beginning to be systematically excavated. The possibility that somewhere in its unexcavated depths there is a long inscription, a bilingual text, a document that gives scholars the purchase they need, that possibility is not negligible. It is unlikely, but it is not impossible. There is something that the undeciphered scripts teach us that has nothing to do with decipherment, something that emerges simply from sitting with the fact of their existence and what it means. Every script on this list was created by people who had no reason to think their words would become permanently unreadable. The scribes who stamped the Indus seals, the palace administrators who inscribed linear A tablets in Cretan storerooms, the Minoan priests who recorded whatever it was they recorded, they were doing something ordinary, something routine, something embedded in the daily practice of their civilization. They were not preserving knowledge for posterity. They were using a tool that their society had developed for practical purposes, in the confidence that the meaning of what they were writing would be understood by the people it was intended for. The idea that the script would become unreadable, that the chain of understanding would break before anyone thought to secure it, would not have occurred to them. Why would it? Their civilization had been using the script for generations. There was no reason to think it would not continue. That confidence was not foolish. Most civilizations do maintain their scripts across time, do pass their languages to their children, do build the institutional structures, the schools, the scribal traditions, the religious practices that keep a writing system alive across centuries. Most of the writing systems that have ever existed are still readable, or have been deciphered, or have left descendant systems that preserve enough continuity for scholars to reconstruct what the original system encoded. The loss of the Indus script, Linear A, and Proto-Elamite is the exception, not the rule. But it is an exception that happened, and it is a reminder that the continuity of knowledge across time is never automatic. It requires active maintenance, active transmission, active investment in the institutions and practices that carry meaning forward. We live in an age that has invested more in the preservation of knowledge than any previous age in history. Digital archives, distributed networks, multiple redundant copies of important documents. The infrastructure of knowledge preservation in the 21st century is vastly more robust than anything the ancient world possessed. And yet the lessons of the undeciphered scripts are not entirely irrelevant to us. The things that most need to be preserved are not always the things that seem most worth preserving at the time. The administrative records of the Indus civilization survived because they were baked clay, durable by accident. The literary and religious texts that would tell us most about the inner life of that civilization, if they existed, did not survive because they were written on perishable materials, lost not by catastrophe but by the ordinary passage of time acting on fragile things. What we choose to preserve, and in what form, and with what investment in redundancy and accessibility, these are choices that every generation makes, usually without thinking of them as choices at all. The undeciphered scripts are a reminder that those choices have consequences, that the silence they have left behind is not the silence of a past that chose to be silent, but of a past that spoke and was not heard, that wrote and was not read, that reached across time with meaning in hand and found no one on the other side who could receive it. And yet there is something else in these scripts, something that is not loss but presence. The seals of the Indus civilization were made by human hands with extraordinary care. The tablets of Linear A were inscribed by people who had learned a complex system and applied it daily with confidence. The Rongorongo tablets were carved by artisans who had mastered a difficult technique in the service of something they considered important. All of that human attention, all of that skill and intention and care, is still visible in the objects. The meaning is gone, but the care remains, and the care is itself a form of communication across time, a message that does not require translation. These things mattered to us. We took time with them. We tried to get them right. That message is legible even when the words are not. And it may be the most important message that the undeciphered scripts carry, not the administrative details of an ancient trade economy or the cosmological narratives of a lost religion, but the simple, persistent fact of human seriousness, That people in every civilization that has ever existed took the trouble to record what they knew, to mark what they owned, to write down what they wanted to preserve, in the belief that the record would outlast the moment. Most of the time they were right. The record did outlast the moment. It is only the meaning that was lost, and the loss of the meaning is not the fault of the people who made the record. They did their part. The chain of transmission that should have carried the meaning to us was broken by forces beyond their control. We are the ones who cannot read what they wrote. And that is not their failure but ours, or rather, not a failure at all, but simply the condition of living in time, in a world where meaning is always contingent and always vulnerable and always, in the end, dependent on the continuity of the human communities that carry it. If this documentary kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are more silences worth sitting with, more languages worth mourning, more moments when the record of what it meant to be human turns out to be stranger and more fragile than we thought. A new documentary every week, always in the hours designed for rest, always going further than you expect.